The rain came down in sheets that October evening in Venice, turning the ancient cobblestones into mirrors that reflected nothing but misery. Marcus Chen sat beneath the colonnade of a closed boutique, his weathered jacket doing little against the cold that had settled into his bones years ago. The tourists hurried past with their expensive umbrellas and designer luggage, their eyes carefully avoiding his presence the way people avoid looking at car accidents. He had learned not to expect anything from them anymore. Then he heard it, a sound that cut through the drumming rain, raw and desperate. A young woman stood 20 feet away, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her. Her phone lay shattered on the wet stones, and her suitcase had tipped over, spilling its contents into the rapidly forming puddles. Most people walked around her, some glanced with mild concern before continuing on their way. Marcus watched her for a long moment, recognizing something in her grief that stirred a memory he had spent 5 years trying to forget. He pushed himself up from the cold stone, his joints protesting the movement. He approached her slowly, careful not to startle her, and began gathering the clothes and belongings floating in the rainwater. She looked up at him with tear-stained cheeks, seeing his tattered appearance, his unkempt beard, his hands darkened with grime. But before we continue with what happened next, if this story resonates with you, hit that subscribe button below and drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Stories like these remind us that humanity exists in the most unexpected places, and I want to share more of them with you. The woman didn't recoil from Marcus the way most people did. Perhaps her pain was too overwhelming to leave room for judgment, or perhaps she simply saw something in his eyes that others missed. He squeezed the water from her clothes as best he could and carefully repacked her suitcase, his movements efficient and practiced. She wiped her face and tried to form words of gratitude, but he simply nodded and began to walk away. She called after him, her voice hoarse from crying, asking if there was anything she could do to thank him. He turned back, and for just a moment, she caught a glimpse of something in his expression that didn't match his circumstances. There was a refinement in the way he moved, an intelligence in his eyes that seemed at odds with his weathered exterior. She insisted on buying him a meal at a nearby cafe that was closing up for the night. The owner initially refused to let Marcus inside, but the woman, whose name was Elena Marchetti, spoke to him with such conviction that he relented. Over cheap coffee and day-old bread, she told Marcus about her grandmother's death, about flying across the world too late to say goodbye, about the family she felt disconnected from, and the inheritance that felt more like a burden than a blessing. Marcus listened the way few people know how to listen anymore, with complete attention and without the urge to fill every silence with advice. When she finally asked about his story, he offered only pieces. He had been someone else once, he told her. He had lost things that couldn't be replaced, made choices that couldn't be unmade. He didn't mention the empire he had built, the towers with his name emblazoned on them, the charitable foundations that still operated under his legacy. He didn't tell her about the day his daughter died in a car accident. While rushing to meet him for a business dinner, he had rescheduled 3 times. Eleanor's phone might have been shattered, but her mind was sharp. She noticed things. The way Marcus held his coffee cup suggested someone who had once attended more formal affairs. The words he chose when he spoke revealed an education that extended far beyond the streets. When she mentioned her family name, Marchetti, explaining that they owned a chain of luxury hotels across Europe, Marcus went very still. His reaction was subtle, barely noticeable, but Elena had spent her life reading people in boardrooms and negotiations. She asked if he knew the name, and he admitted that he had stayed in their hotels once, long ago, but there was something in the way he said it. Something that made Elena pull out her damaged phone and attempt to navigate to her family's corporate history page. The screen flickered and died before she could find what she was looking for. They parted ways as the rain finally stopped, and the cafe owner made it clear they needed to leave. Elena pressed some money into Marcus's hand despite his protests and gave him the name of her hotel, telling him to come by if he needed anything. He pocketed the money with a quiet thank you and disappeared into the Venetian night. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter meant something more than a simple act of kindness. Back in her hotel room, one of her family's properties, she used her laptop to search through old business records, following an instinct she couldn't quite explain. What she found in those archives made her hands tremble and her breath catch in her throat. Marcus Chen wasn't just any homeless man. 20 years ago, he had been one of the most powerful real estate developers in Asia, a billionaire who had partnered with the Marchetti family on 3 major hotel developments in Singapore, Tokyo, and Hong Kong. His company, Chen Global Properties, had been legendary for its innovation and its founder's ruthless business acumen. But there was more. Elena discovered newspaper articles from 15 years ago detailing the tragic death of his daughter, followed by the systematic dismantling of his entire empire. Marcus had sold everything, liquidated every asset, and disappeared from public life. The business world had speculated endlessly about his breakdown, but no one had seen or heard from him in over a decade. Her grandfather had spoken of Marcus Chen occasionally, always with a mixture of respect and sadness, mentioning him as the partner who could have changed everything if only tragedy hadn't broken him. Elena stared at the old photograph on her screen, showing a confident man in an expensive suit shaking hands with her grandfather. The eyes were the same ones that had looked at her with such understanding just hours earlier, but everything else had been stripped away by time and grief. She spent the entire night searching for him, walking the streets of Venice with a hotel security guard, checking every corner and colonnade where the homeless gathered. Venice held thousands of shadows, and Marcus Chen had learned how to disappear into them. As dawn broke over the canals, painting the water with gold and pink light, Elena stood on the Rialto Bridge and made a decision. She would find him, not to exploit his past or satisfy her curiosity, but because she recognized something in his story that mirrored her own sense of loss and disconnection. The question was whether Marcus wanted to be found, and whether the man who had once built empires had any interest in returning to a world he had deliberately left behind. What Elena didn't know was that Marcus had spent the night watching her search from a distance, wrestling with emotions he thought he had buried along with his former life, and that her determination had awakened something in him that he feared more than poverty or obscurity. The next morning, Elena cancelled her flight home and extended her stay in Venice indefinitely. She contacted the local homeless outreach programs, describing Marcus and offering a reward for information about his whereabouts. Most of the volunteers were skeptical, accustomed to wealthy tourists who developed brief fascinations with poverty before returning to their comfortable lives. But one worker, an elderly nun named Sister Teresa, who ran a soup kitchen near the train station, recognized Elena's description. She knew Marcus, though he went by a different name on the streets, and he came by for meals 3 times a week. Sister Teresa agreed to pass along a message, but warned Elena that Marcus was a deeply private man who had refused all attempts to help him transition off the streets. He had told her once during a rare moment of openness that he was serving a penance that would never be complete, and that comfort of any kind felt like a betrayal of his daughter's memory. When Marcus arrived at the soup kitchen that evening, Sister Teresa handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Elena explaining what she had discovered about his past and making a simple request. She wanted to understand why he had given up everything, not out of morbid curiosity, but because she was standing at a similar crossroads in her own life. She had inherited her grandfather's position in the family business, but felt suffocated by the weight of expectations and the emptiness of wealth without purpose. She asked him to meet her at the cafe where they had talked the following evening at sunset. She promised she wanted nothing from him except his story, and that whatever he shared would remain between them. Marcus read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking slightly. Part of him wanted to disappear even deeper into the anonymity of street life, to let Marcus Chen remain dead and buried beneath the weight of his choices. But another part of him, a part he thought had died with his daughter, felt something stir at the possibility of connection, of being seen and understood by someone who asked for nothing but truth. He showed up at the cafe the next evening, arriving early and watching from across the street as Elena sat alone at a small table, nervously checking her watch. She had dressed simply, none of the designer clothes from their first meeting, and she looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable. Marcus almost turned away 3 different times before finally crossing the street and sitting down across from her. She looked up with an expression of relief and gratitude that made his chest tighten. Over the next 3 hours, as the cafe filled and emptied around them, and the owner brought them endless cups of coffee without comment, Marcus told her everything. He described the intoxication of building an empire, the arrogance of believing that success was the only measure of a life well lived. He talked about his daughter, Sarah, who had wanted to be a teacher, but felt pressured to join the family business. He confessed that on the day she died, rushing to make their rescheduled dinner, he had been considering cancelling again because of an important investor call. The guilt hadn't faded with time. It had calcified into something hard and permanent inside his chest. After the accident, Marcus had found himself unable to perform even the simplest business functions. Every meeting felt meaningless. Every deal felt like a betrayal of what truly mattered. He had started giving away his money, first to charitable causes, then to anyone who needed it, as if he could somehow balance the cosmic scales through generosity. But no amount of money given away had eased the crushing weight of his failure as a father. So he had walked away from everything, deliberately choosing poverty as a form of penance, believing that if he suffered enough, if he stripped away every comfort and privilege, he might finally earn the right to forgive himself. Elena listened without interruption, tears streaming down her face by the time he finished. When he finally fell silent, she reached across the table and took his weathered hands in her own. She told him that her grandmother, the one whose death had brought her to Venice, had spent the last decade of her life estranged from the family because she had dared to criticize their business practices and their obsession with expansion over ethics. Elena had been the only family member to maintain contact, and her grandmother had left her everything, bypassing the rest of the Marchetti line. The inheritance came with a letter urging Elena to use the money and influence to reshape the family business into something that actually helped people, rather than simply extracting profit from them. She confessed that she had been contemplating walking away from it all, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task and paralyzed by the fear of failure. Meeting Marcus had shown her something crucial. Running away from responsibility, even painful responsibility, didn't bring peace or redemption. It only created a different kind of suffering. She asked Marcus a question that would change both of their lives. What if they worked together? What if he helped her transform the Marchetti hotels into something that honored both his daughter's memory and her grandmother's vision? She needed his experience, his understanding of how businesses could either extract value or create it. She needed someone who had learned the hard way what actually mattered. Marcus sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling with possibilities he had forbidden himself to consider for over a decade. The idea terrified him, but beneath the fear was something else, something that felt dangerous and fragile like hope. He told Elena he needed time to think, and she respected that, giving him her email address and room number before they parted ways. Marcus spent the next week in a state of internal warfare, walking the streets of Venice at all hours, arguing with himself and with the memory of his daughter. On the seventh night, he found himself at a small church he had passed 1,000 times without entering. Inside, in the flickering candlelight, he finally allowed himself to imagine what Sarah would actually want for him. Not eternal suffering, not deliberate poverty, but something harder to accept. She would want him to take everything he had learned from his mistakes and use it to make the world slightly better than he found it. The realization didn't erase his guilt, but it shifted something fundamental in his understanding of responsibility. Penance wasn't about punishment, it was about restoration. The next morning, Marcus showed up at Elena's hotel, clean-shaven for the first time in years, wearing clothes that Sister Teresa had helped him acquire from a donation center. Helena opened her door and saw not the broken homeless man from the rain-soaked street, but glimpses of the formidable businessman he had once been, now tempered by hard-won wisdom and genuine humility. She invited him in, and they spent the entire day mapping out a vision for what the Marchetti properties could become. Marcus proposed turning several underperforming hotels into hybrid facilities that would serve both paying guests and provide transitional housing for homeless families. He suggested hiring people from vulnerable populations, creating training programs that would give them real career paths. He outlined partnerships with local communities rather than the extractive model most hotel chains employed. Elena contributed her own ideas about sustainable practices and creating spaces that honored local culture, rather than bulldozing it in favor of generic luxury. Over the following months, their partnership deepened into something neither of them had expected. The Marchetti family board was predictably resistant to Elena's proposals. Viewing Marcus as a homeless con artist, who had somehow manipulated their young, grieving heiress. But Elena stood firm, threatening to use her controlling shares to force changes if necessary. Marcus helped her navigate the political complexities of corporate governance, teaching her strategies he had refined during his years building Chen Global Properties. Together they were formidable, combining her fresh perspective and moral clarity with his experience and tactical thinking. The first pilot project launched in Milan, transforming a struggling Marchetti property into a revolutionary hybrid hotel that immediately attracted international attention. News outlets couldn't resist the story of the homeless billionaire who had returned from obscurity to reinvent an industry. Marcus hated the attention, but he endured it because the publicity helped the model spread faster than they had dared hope. Sarah's name appeared throughout their work, never exploitatively, but as a quiet reminder of what they were trying to honor. The training programs for homeless workers were called Sarah's Pathways. The sustainability initiatives were developed under the Sarah Chen Foundation for Responsible Development. Marcus poured his energy into mentoring the young people they hired, many of whom reminded him of his daughter in various ways, all of them trying to build lives from difficult circumstances. He was patient with them in ways he had never been patient with Sarah, and the irony wasn't lost on him. But Elena reminded him that growth was the point, that becoming better through suffering only mattered if you actually used the lessons learned. 2 years after their chance meeting in the Venetian rain, Marcus and Elena stood together at the grand opening of their 10th hybrid property, this one in Singapore, in a building that had once housed Chen Global Properties headquarters. The symbolism wasn't accidental. Marcus had spent months negotiating to buy back his former building, and transforming it into something that served both prosperity and purpose felt like completing a circle he had thought would remain forever broken. The event was attended by business leaders, government officials, and dozens of the program's graduates who now worked throughout the Marchetti organization. As Marcus looked out at the crowd, he caught sight of a photograph of Sarah displayed subtly near the entrance, showing her at 16, laughing at something outside the frame full of possibility and life. The ache of her absence would never fully disappear, but it had transformed into something bearable, something that coexisted with purpose and even moments of quiet joy. Elena, standing beside him, had become the business partner and friend he hadn't known he needed. Together they had built something that neither could have created alone, proof that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about honoring it through better choices in the present. The homeless man who had helped a crying tourist had found his way back to himself, not by returning to who he was before, but by becoming someone his daughter might have been proud of. And the lost heiress had discovered that inherited wealth and influence could be transformed into genuine change when wielded with wisdom and humility. Their story reminded anyone who heard it that moments of connection, even between strangers in the rain, could reshape entire futures if given the chance to grow.